Welcome to another episode of Anecdotal Evidence. I actually didn't think I would do one quite so soon, but in reviewing and thinking about the last one I did, I sort of set myself up for it. Because there's definitely something I want to add further. I'm not going to reiterate all of what I just said in my last episode, except for the one that today I want to talk about law and order. And right alongside that, I'll put justice and fairness. They're two separate categories, all right? At least in the discussion that I'm having. Now, I stated in my last episode that the first president, not president, precedent, depending on your phonetic interpretation, is the existence and the belief in the existence of God. Now, I could go into that more, but that's where I sort of start. And if you didn't hear what I said about that, I invite you to go back and listen to it. But I'll start off by telling it in a story way. It's like many years ago, I think it was like maybe 2000. Whenever Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and she was often going out and, making her presence known in various other countries' goings on, and often that was we got to see it on the evening news or whatever, because she was already making a bid for the presidency at that point. But I, quite personally, by 2014, 2015, I was quite put off by Hillary Clinton. And I didn't like anything that I saw. I thought she was arrogant. I thought she was presumptuous and thought she was some sort of special royalty or something. And it came over. I mean, it came over. Maybe not everybody saw it. Obviously, it didn't, but a lot of people did. But as I used to enjoy watching the news, at least I did for a while until it all became internet dominated, then I sort of started losing my interest in the news, or the mainstream news, I should say. But one night I was watching a show, and she was an emissary as the Secretary of State in some other country, and something was going on. I can't remember what. But she was making a speech about something, and she said this phrase. And it's the first time I'd ever really heard it spoken in the way that she spoke it. But she used the phrase law and order as if it were actually like the Constitution of the United States, right? And that's when a really big red flag went up, and I started hearing all these politicians from that point on talking about law and order, and how this everything is based on law and order. Well, that's a half truth and a half lie. And the half lie part of it sort of takes the half truth right out. Because, it's like there's a thing in the law which everybody in America, at least up to this point, they got educated through various different media, including institutions, about certain aspects of the law, the basic common areas of law that a basic American citizen should be aware of. And 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 anyone who can remember as far back as the 50s and 60s and 70s, and maybe even the 80s a little bit, they can see a difference in a lot of different things, obviously. But I'm talking about law and order. So let's take that. Let's go for law. I've already stated that the first precedence of law, I don't precedence or precedent. I don't know what the correct usage of the word is. Somebody can look it up and maybe make a comment about it and correct me if I'm wrong. But the first precedent of law is God. Now, if God is the author, essentially, of what we call law, and we have examples, the best example we have is Mosaic law, the story of the Ten Commandments, that were given by God, and that is at least in our current time memory, it's the closest thing to an explanation of where that came from. So the Ten Commandments was the first law, basically. I mean, there were other laws. The kings had laws, right? Most of their laws were all about control and punitive damage, which comes in. It's not gone. And so the law of Moses, the first law, Ten Commandments, even though, and this is part of the story too, even though Moses destroyed the original and then supposedly rewrote them from memory, and I'm not saying he didn't, but the first law, according to Moses, not necessarily according to God, because we didn't get to see the original. We don't know exactly what it was for sure, word for word that he wrote. We have to take Moses' word for it. And it's kind of hard to go back and ask anybody about that. So that's what we got. And it's logical. It makes sense. And Moses at least did, he tried to do his best in terms of delivering those laws, other than the fact that he got angry and broke them in the first place. But first law, most people who are Christians, or all Christians, I would hope, would know what the first law of the Ten Commandments is. And that is, thou shalt love your God, or me, your God, with all your heart and all your mind. And I paraphrase. That's the first law. And the key word in there is love. Now, I'll go a little bit further. Okay, so we're still talking about law. So see, we have a contrast between law. It's like the king's law and God's law. And then there's man's law. All right? Man's law is quite often neither God's law or the government's law, or whatever, the nation law. So that's why there's a justification for order, law and order. Law is where it's supposed to be, and if you don't be that way, we got somebody that is an order of military police of some form or another who will come and put you in line. And that evolved into the idea of courts. And then the most horrendous thing that ever happened out of law, it's like, I would, if it was live, I would give a prize who could ever come up with this answer, just and realize it. The worst thing to come out of law, ever. All law. The worst thing that came out of law was similar to the worst thing that came out of money. What came out of money was usury, and what came out of law was lawyers, which are just usurers of the law. And if you look at and I'll get to modern law, but let's stay a little bit with the progression of the evolution of law, so we can maybe have the better understanding of what I'm trying to say. Now I want to go back to the time of Moses, when in Genesis when the Israelites are still wandering out in the desert, and several events have happened, and and they're in the process of creating basically the Mosaic law. The laws are being written down and broken down into various categories and interpretations. And one of the examples of what was going on was at some point during this process, one of Moses's prized warriors or generals or captains had basically uh, had adultery with the wife of another man. And there's other details to the story, but that doesn't matter. And both of them were brought before Moses. And his judgment, and this is very important, because this was the first major judgment made as based on, okay, if you break these commandments, these are part of the repercussions, the punishments, the punitive damages that will be inflicted on you for breaking these commandments. Now, if you realize that even in the commandments that were written out by Moses, there wasn't any stipulation that there was punishment by man for breaking those commandments. That's a very important point, right? Nowhere in the Ten Commandments, which is the first basis of all, the first written established base of all Western law, there is no mention, except for the Mosaic interpretation, of punitive damage, of punishment, or not even discipline. All right? That's important because it's not there. It's only there because Mosaic law put it there. In fact, Mosaic law, if you think about it, was taking the best of Moses' own experience with law, which came from being a son of Pharaoh. He was well acquainted with the Pharaoh's law and the way of regulating money and taxes and ownership and property and what, and that's where where the rights were. You only had rights if you were wealthy and had property, and that's the way it was. So it's like that law, of Pharaoh's law, got merged with the Ten Commandments, and that became the Mosaic law. So the punitive damage came directly from, in my opinion, Moses being the son of Pharaoh, because he had that experience. And everything that they did in terms of writing out the law was something of their own volition, pretty much. I don't really, they might have done things where they went through rituals and everything else to religiosity, to make religion out of what they were doing, or make it look like it was the religion. But out of that came lawyers. Not for a while. I mean, it took a while for the lawyers to come up. But jump forward about maybe several thousand years. We'll just call it that. Jump forward in time from the time when the Israelites were wandering in the desert to the point when they're established as a nation, and to the point where they're nearly at their end. And that's when Yeshua comes on the scene. And just in case people don't know who I'm talking about when I say Yeshua, Yeshua is a close phonetic pronunciation of the original name of whom we refer to as Jesus. So I prefer Yeshua. It just feels better for me. But at any rate, during that time period, when Yeshua was here, there was a point during his teachings when he was ministering, and he had his disciples and apostles all around him. And he walked into the streets of one of the cities one day, and there was a a whole crowd of men and a pile of rocks, and they were all taking rocks in their hand. And in the center of the circle that they were forming was a woman who was obviously a prostitute, and she was like, on the ground just getting ready to get killed. And Yeshua stepped into the circle and said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." I'm going to say it again. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Okay. Now, that in itself, by itself, without touching into anything else that I'm going to touch into, is a profound teaching. Is a very profound teaching, and most people understand the immediate meaning, but there's deeper meanings, and one of the deeper meanings has to do with law, right? And I'll get back to Yeshua, but I'm going to jump back again. So we go back to Moses, and the two people are laying on the ground, getting ready to get the first judgment of all for the crime of adultery. And who was it that cast the first stone? If you answered Moses, you are correct. Now I have to say, is Moses or was Moses without sin? I don't think that anyone would claim that. If they did, then they haven't read the Bible or the Torah or the stories. They haven't read it, because Moses had a problem. He had an anger problem, and in fact, he kind of pissed God off, and God wouldn't let him get into Israel. So there you have that. So Moses was definitely not a man without sin, and yet he cast the first stone for the crime in which those people were gathered to kill that woman in Israel in the future. So Yeshua was referring to that, and some wise men who were actually studying the truth at the time might have recognized that, because it's there. Because the one who cast the first stone was definitely not without sin, and the one who cast the first stone is the one responsible for establishing what the punitive damage for breaking that particular commandment was. Mosaic law, Moses cast the first stone. Okay, well, I could stop and let you think about that, but you can just think about it on your own time, because I'm moving on here. So we're still talking about law and order, right? So there's interjection right at the moment, just as an underlying understanding that during this whole process, there is a conflict that's going on, a spiritual conflict already a spiritual conflict represented by the conquerors of the world and the conquered of the world. Now it's like, Yahweh, the God of the desert, came to Moses, and the people that they went to were the conquered. Now, all of the other gods and everything else are all part of the conquering. And the conquering is basically a force of evil, because it's death and destruction. And regardless of how one wants to glorify history, death and destruction is death and destruction. And there is no justification for death and destruction. It happens. But if we were actually following the real law and the real order, we would have outgrown all this shit a long time ago. But we've been kept in a perpetual state of ignorance and bondage to law and order, which is basically false. Now, I jump back to Yeshua, time of Yeshua before his crucifixion. And at one point, he was having a discussion. I believe it's in the Acts. I'm not absolutely sure, but it's in there. And Yeshua was having a discussion with his apostles and disciples. about law, and he was speaking about the law of love. And in that process, he said that he didn't come to end the law, but to fulfill it. And which goes back to the first core word in the first commandment, which is love. Thou shalt love thy God and thyself with all thy heart and thy mind and thy soul. And paraphrased. But Yeshua said that the supreme law was love, and he explained that when one becomes within the sphere and the embrace of love and embraces love as authority, as law, then it sits like a capstone of the pyramid of the original intention of the Ten Commandments, or the foundation of Mosaic law. So reaching a height of the consciousness of love and being able to act within love, the more you act within love, the more you are liberated from the laws, particularly the laws of punitive damage. Although they still may inflict upon them on you by force, which will bring us up to, modern times. So the laws, the law of Yeshua basically told us that there was a higher law than the law of Moses, and the law of the land, and the law of the kings, and the law of the pharaohs, and the laws of the emperors, and so on and so forth. And Yeshua was the supreme liberator of our consciousness. He planted the seeds of desire for truth and understanding. And so people went out and used his example to find out the reality of what's really going on. So there's a lot of history between now and then, for sure. But here we are now. You know that law, and it's not just America, but America is a perfect example. Law has become an institution of which justice and fairness may be hanging on the wall in terms of a word, but not existent within the actual actions of the courts. And why is that? Well, first of all, before I go into that, let me add something in here. I said earlier that law and order and fairness and justice were in two different categories, right? And that's because something has been taken out of the core of what the law is supposed to be. And that is literally what is used to be referred to in a legal sense, not just a common law sense, but the spirit and the intent of the law. Now it's been said that there's two parts of the law: the spirit and intent of the law and the letter of the law. Okay, well, the letter of the law is Pharaoh, presidents, kings, emperors. That's the letter of the law, going all the way back to Babylon. The spirit of the law is the word in the first commandment, which is love. And the spirit of the law, which is the last commandment of Yeshua, which is love. All right? So that is the spirit and the intent of the law. Or the intent, the spirit of the law is love. The intent of the law is justice and fairness. But the spirit of the law and intent of the law has been taken out and totally displaced 100% by the letter of the law. Now, we have a situation where the law is like a religion, it's an institution. In order to even understand the language and the meaning of what's being spoken in a so-called court of law, one has to have special dispensation or make a very huge effort to learn the language of legalese. See, lawyers go to school so they can learn legalese and the ritual procedures by which they can control the outcome. All right? Lawyers on either side of any case. So it's like they have created an institution, a fraternity that is literally shielded. They shield themselves, and they've gone so far that, and I think most people have probably noticed at this point, but every single politician that you can look at, with maybe one exception, and that's Donald Trump. And there may have been others, but in the high 90 percentile of politicians, people have held public office in the United States, from the local county townships all the way up through the states and into the federal government as representatives and even president. They're all lawyers. Every last stinking one of them. They're all part of you. If you notice that, people like county commissioners, for example, they don't do a lot except shuffle papers and numbers around. I mean, quite frankly, I feel sorry for them that they have to fill their head with such total worthless bullshit. But they get paid a good price for doing it because they're not doing much else. They're not growing food. They're not, teaching children. They're not, being creative, performing their soul. They're not doing any of that. They're sitting there, reading things off of pieces of paper. That's it. That's what county commissioners do. Now, pretty much, it doesn't get much, I don't think, much more different than that. It just goes up the line. So what you're reading on the paper becomes increasingly more quote unquote important or whatever. But they're all lawyers. Constitution was composed by a combination. There was lawyers that were part of that. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was a lawyer, so was John Adams. Probably a couple more that I don't know about. But they were involved with the people on enough of a level to where the developing the Constitution at least left the door open, which is why we were able to do amendments to give us our rights, which should have been in there in the first place. But you understand is that the Constitution tried really hard to put the spirit and intent of the law in the law, that it's in the preamble and everything else that's stated there. Like, that, for example, the inalienable right of pursuit of happiness is referencing that, even though it's sort of ambiguous. But any lawyer would, even if they don't have any response to it, understand what the spirit and intent is supposed to be. But they've created these legalese barriers. They've interpreted the laws and made it so they themselves are pretty much, as they like to say, above the law, right? They like to say no one's above the law, but the lawyers are. The lawyers are all above the law because it's their plaything. It's their device that they use to keep their lofty positions in culture and society and have power over us, particularly when they become politicians. So the point is that the law and order. Well, let's take order. I went into law quite a bit. Now let's get into order. What is order? Where there's different kinds of looking at what order is. Order, in the most grandest sense, is the balance of everything we see in the universe. All these incredibly gazillion objects spinning around in space and hardly ever destroying each other, even though they do, because it's like everything is on a it's on a timer. You know, it is. And so it's like order on a celestial sense is like the universe. It's a perfect example of what real order is. Now, it's like the order of cooperative action where different individuals or beings gathered together and in concert they do something. They create something, they perform something, whatever, but they do it together, right? Cooperatively. That's another kind of order, all right? A little bit less cosmic and original and organic is the order of policing, the order of controlling, the order of the sword. The sword is the order which is employed by the letter of the law. The spirit and intent of the law are only there as decoration at this point. We need a revised constitution, but we need to do it without lawyers. And I'll leave you with that. I hope I've provoked some thought. I needed to express myself. So to those of you who watch this, I thank you. This is the end of episode 8. There will probably be more. So enjoy the rest of this incredibly crazy year.